Morning, guys. Everyone well?
Morning, Liam.
Good, thank you.
It's been a while since we did the last one. It feels a bit wrong that we've had to delay it so long, but it's good to have all of you back for a conversation. So what we want to talk about today is accessibility testing and maybe stretch it to usability testing as well. I feel it's a testing type that's often overlooked, not necessarily considered, but it's becoming more and more important with regulations in the UK and US specifically. Obviously, regulations elsewhere in the world as well, but those are probably the two main ones. So does anyone want to just open with maybe just giving us a brief explanation of what accessibility testing actually is?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. So accessibility testing kind of comes from that legal framework originally. So there's two acts in America and the UK. So there's the ADA Section 508 and the WCAG guidelines, which originally apply to Europe. And that's about making sure that your website or software service or application is accessible or usable for people with disabilities or specific needs. So that could be something like color blindness, blindness, or hard of hearing, things of that nature. And how it differs to usability. Usability is making sure that the user is having a pleasant experience with that application, and that's more about catering to everybody. So they are some sort of differences between the two there. That's pretty summarizes it reasonably well.
Perfect. And like you mentioned, the goal is to create digital experiences that are inclusive and provide equal access to information and functionality of basically to everyone, regardless of your abilities. So just jumping straight into it, are there specific sites which are more important to have accessibility, a really good standard, high standard of accessibility compared to others? So, i.e., can certain companies get away with not having to do accessibility testing, whereas with others it's really important?
Yeah, it's a good point. So there's different ratings within the WCAG guidelines. So for the UK, it can be rated depending on how compliant you are with the guidelines. And I think to kind of answer that question, I would go with it would be dependent on your user base. So if you're looking at something that's maybe internally facing to the company, and you'd know that there's nobody with accessibility needs in the company because it's quite small and you know everybody, it's probably less of importance. But if you've got a public-facing service, some of the big applications, so you look at anything from Google, anything from Microsoft, it will need to be accessibility compliant because the volume of traffic, the volume of users that will be engaging with that platform will highlight a lack of accessibility provision within it.
And what is interesting there is that from a legal perspective, I think, Steve, that is correct. But from a business perspective, it's also a little bit different. Right? So if your user base, and I'm thinking of an example of one of our clients, so their user base are people 60, 65 plus, and they don't necessarily have disabilities. But for them, technology, and I'm generalizing, technology is a little bit different. It's a little bit harder to see the colors on the website. From an accessibility and usability perspective, things are different for, and again, generalizing, 65, 70-year-old people than 20-year-old people. So their website that they go to, and it's not a big base like Google, but that's that organization's whole client base. So if you look at that organization, 80% of their client base will have a different need from the website, the accessibility of that site, how big the font is, because can they see without their glasses, where the buttons are, text to speech. So even if it's not a legal requirement for that organization, and then it should be, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but from can my user base use my website, it's also a big consideration.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think if you look at something that, like, for example, should be applied to all applications or websites, would be something like seizure safe profiles. So you can't have like flashing juxtaposition text and colors on a screen as part of your service because it could induce someone with epilepsy. So there's also an element of the severity of the risk of the impact of not doing the change. The font being difficult to read for someone who's elderly, I can maybe get away with as a business, but I can't get away with causing someone to have a seizure and legal and ethical moral ramifications of doing that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because someone mentioned to me the other day, and both of you touched on it. The user base is so important to consider. So if you think about, I'm just going to use an example. Let's say an investment company or a wealth business, and you look at their user base. It's probably safe to assume that people that visit their website are slightly older. It's probably people that have a bit more, I want to say, disposable income to invest. And obviously, there you consider that potentially their eyes are slightly worse, maybe other aspects. So maybe in that situation, it becomes a lot more important. Not that it's less important on others, but it is that balance between how much investment you want to make, how important it is. Obviously, there are certain sites and industries which are heavily regulated, where it's a legal regulation, or expectation for you to actually certify to certain levels. But then you have those other ones where it's not necessarily regulatory. It's not getting forced on you, but you realize it's actually the right thing to do, and it's important given who visits my website to be able to provide the best experience possible. You touched on a couple of examples there, flashing images and that type of thing. What are the I almost want to say, what are the main factors that one needs to try and address when you're looking at accessibility? And maybe before anyone answers, if someone can just explain the three levels of WCAG as well, A, AA, and AAA. You don't have to go through every one, but just at a high level, what they mean and why there are three different levels as well.
Yeah, so what I would say is around the WCAG, it's quite difficult to. They do a reasonably good job. So if you go to their website and you look at the standards, which are constantly updated as well. So that's something that this isn't a fixed point as well. So something to maybe point out is that for businesses, this isn't a case of we're now compliant and that's great. They're constantly evolving the guidelines and improving them, and that's to keep pace with technological changes and better understanding of people's specific user accessibility needs, and how it's important to them. The tiering system is kind of around like a gold standard. So for, like, say, something like a public facing website, you would want to be at level 3. You'd want to be the highest level of compliance. If you're a small startup company and you're selling an app on the App Store to 12,000 people, 10,000 people, you could probably get away with a 1 or 1 star. And the differences are kind of nuanced in the specific elements. So let's say color contrast as an example, that if you're 3-star, I'm just put this off my head. If you're 3-star, everything on your website, every single page needs to have a color contrast ratio that is, say, of a specific number. And then for a 1, it might be 75% of the material needs to be of the same level of compliance. So it's how thorough a lot of the times you are in terms of ensuring the standards. And then there's also higher thresholds of higher thresholds on what that looks like as well, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think you said it, Steve. So the basics should still be in place for all 3 levels. And the basics are things like, can I use my keyboard when I can't use a mouse? Can I see the screen? And are text readers able to read what is on the screen back to me? So those basics are still in place for all 3 levels, but it's the thoroughness, as you said, Steve, and some nuances around it. But at a basic level, can I use my keyboard? And can some screen reader read what is on the screen to me so I can actually understand what is going on the screen?
Stefan, where does accessibility testing fit in?
In terms of the wider usability testing?
Yeah, and I think also, so in terms of when you would do it, when you would consider it, is it deemed to be part of manual testing? Is it deemed to be part of I don't know, non-functional testing?
In that space,
where would you position that?
I think it's more on the non-functional side, where it's more of a non-functional side, I think. But although inherently it is something that you'll also possibly test as part of functional testing as well. I think a lot of those things you would pick up. Yeah, for example, if there's not a next button, or those buttons are not the same, you would pick it up as a part of your functional testing. But if you look at OSTGB or the normal categorization, I would say mostly falls under the non-functional testing, although there are overlaps with functional testing as well.
It is also typically, to add on to that, it's also typically something people do ad hoc at the end of a project. And we've seen now that the trend, especially because companies are being forced to do that, that accessibility testing becomes part of the development process and moving it, shifting it more and more and more left from a design perspective, because that's where accessibility really starts. It starts with design. So if you can catch those things, accessibility issues in the design phase, that makes it a lot easier to catch and fix and build that into the process. But we've also seen test analysts being exposed to accessibility testing, introducing accessibility testing and requirement analysis. So if I'm a functional tester, manual functional tester, and I'm sitting in a requirements analysis session, and there's a design, and I start asking questions about, even if I don't know a lot about accessibility, but do you think this ratio is right? Are there accessibility things we need to consider as part of the requirements for the story, or for the story that we're taking into the sprint? We're seeing testers slowly moving and shifting left with accessibility testing as well. Unfortunately, there's still something, because of the history of it, where companies decide, oh, we are live or we're about to go live, let's look at accessibility testing, which is a typical example, but it's too late. And we're advocating that we start moving it left and start having that conversation at least earlier in the life cycle.
Yeah, it's like quality. Accessibility is like quality. You can't test quality into a product. You have to build it in from the start. And to pick up on your point on accessibility on a previous client, I'll get non-functional requirements or user stories that say things like application must be accessible, or application accessibility is not applicable, or system must cater for people with accessibility needs. Whereas I pointed out was that what specific user needs are you thinking that we need to cater for? Have you identified a user group in the company that needs, for example, contrast readers, or they use a screen reader on a regular basis? Because that's something we can't just ad hoc find out. That needs to be built in from the initial design. And that's where you're right, test analysts and testers need to challenge those kinds of requirements and feedback to the business that I can't test that for you. That's something that we need to really build out in the design.
Yeah, a lot of the time people only think about performance and security, but this is in a way a very low-hanging fruit kind of requirement that if you just explicitly think about it and challenge it in the requirements up front, it's something that can, without too much effort, really be baked into it from the start, like you guys said. So,
and what is interesting there, Stefan, is that with performance, it's always a conversation. Should we do performance testing? When do we do performance testing? What is the business getting out of it? And we've done a lot of exercise in improving the value of performance testing, for example. But accessibility testing, if you look at a business and think we've said earlier, it directly increases your user base and people who are able to engage with your business. So from a business perspective, it should be quite an easy sell to say, if we start doing this, can use our website or our business or engage with our business, and our current user base won't be frustrated and leave. So I think from a business perspective, it's quite an easy business case to make.
And yeah, and you mentioned the other day when we had a similar discussion, companies might think, is it really worth it? How many will it really increase my user base? But you mentioned something interesting to say. Sometimes there's a temporary disability, like I forgot my glasses at home, and that's almost a very common kind of scenario. And something silly like that, somebody trying to view a website and not being able to view whatever they want to view could actually have a big impact. And I think there are certain cases like that actually, have a bigger impact than you would anticipate. So, definitely an easy use case to make for the business.
Yeah, and luckily my parents aren't listening to that, but they are older. And if they want to do banking, for example, they phone us and say, I can't interact with the banking site. Please transfer some money. Or I can't sign up to this policy. I need my policy documentation. It's tax season. Please go get it for me because I don't understand the system. I don't know where to get that from. And luckily, we are still there to do it for them. But I imagine people in similar situations, they don't have anyone to phone and they just don't interact with that website. They just don't get the policy, or they have to find a broker or something to do it for them. But the point is that they are being frustrated and they're not going to interact with your business because of the site not being accessible to them. And they don't have any disabilities, but it's just that accessibility part of it. And the point I'm trying to make is that accessibility is not only for people with impairments or disabilities, but it's also, as Leon has said, look at your user base and see how they would interact. And the profile of them and how easy it is for them to interact with technology or the site.
Yeah, and I think another business benefit is I worked with a UX designer at my at an old client, and something he pointed out to me is if you design your website or application to be accessible and meet the guidelines, you will accidentally make it usable. A system application that is accessible, has good contrast, spacing, ratios, layout, and structure to meet those accessibility guidelines is an aesthetically pleasing website. They're nice to look at, they're nice to navigate, they're nice to follow. So you're killing two birds with one stone a lot of the time. Well, there's certainly a lot of crossover between the two. So it's also another advantage that you'll probably get a better designed website out the back of it as well.
Okay, great. So you guys have done an amazing job at selling accessibility testing. And now there are people out there that's never done it before. Where do they get started? How do you actually go about doing the testing? Is it purely a manual task, or are there automated tools that you can use as well? But maybe before that, just as a starting point, someone that's never done accessibility testing, a company that's maybe never looked into accessibility testing, what are some of the starting points for those folks?
What I would say is don't go straight into reading the guidelines because they're very complicated. There's a lot of detail in there. I'll give you a really simple use case example, which I think anyone can use. Most Microsoft products have accessibility testing tool sets built into those. So if I'm building a PowerPoint presentation or a Word document, at the bottom of that toolbar, Microsoft will tell you there's an accessibility issue there for you to investigate. If you just double click on that link, it will take you to a toolbar and it'll say, for example, you've used a merged table on this header here, which if I'm using a screen reader will create a problem for that user. Or the contrast between the title and the background is off. It's quite hard to read. And that will start to get your head into, oh, these are the kinds of things that we should spot and kind of notice. That's a really simple way of doing it. Another tool I would use would be something like a color contrast checker, which are free online. And that's just a way of checking that the ratio that's being used on the site is appropriate. And there's also like online tools you can use. These are all manual things you can do pretty quickly without having need to build up a huge skill set in terms of doing them. You just need to have an awareness of the issues first, and then the tools are available for you to use.
Yeah, and similarly to the Microsoft things that you've mentioned, Steve, if you go to your website in a browser and you go to the development tools, they have accessibility tool built into that already. So for Chrome, for example, Google Lighthouse will give you accessibility scores and ratings. The same with Edge. So it's already built in. If you are an organization saying, it would be interesting to see where I stand, that's a very good start. You go F12, you go to Google Lighthouse, you say I want accessibility report, and we'll spit out a fairly detailed accessibility report already about your website and what is going on the page it sees. There are fancier tools like Axe and Wave that can do that. But I think as a start, if you do the native checks that's in the browser, that will give you a great start. Just to understand what you are seeing. It also, as Steve has said, you don't have to go read the manual to do that. It will spit out a couple of fairly obvious things, talking about contrast, talking about screen readers, talking about usability and the keyboard usage of that. And you can already start with that report and taking that to your design team or your engineering world and saying, we are seeing this, what does it mean? So that's already a really, really good start. From an automation perspective, there are tools that will help you with that, but it is still, I think it's still a very manual effort, as it should be. It's a report, it's not on anything. So it's a report that you get, you have to rectify and test again. A lot of people have started building that into their automation frameworks. They kind of call it the missing tip of the automation pyramid from a visual perspective. So if you have a baseline to say our baseline is already accessible, let's just compare every release against that baseline to make sure that it still looks the same. That's already a very good start from a regression testing perspective to say, are the elements still looking as we've designed them according to our accessibility guidelines that were given to the design team. So you can start building that in your process, but as a first glance, use the browser and the native tools that are in there.
And if you're looking like, say, more of a UAT focus to it, reach out to the company that you're working in, or the client you're working in. Do you have anyone in the company or the client that has accessibility needs? and get them to just use the site with you or use the application with you. You can also reach out to, I know quite a lot of charities in the UK will actually offer people up as volunteers to test your website that are maybe short-sighted or registered blind, and then they will actually give you a feedback report on what their experiences were like. That's really useful to get actual hands-on user experience of the site as well.
And I think that's invaluable, Steve. If you look at accessibility and impairments, people with those impairments or disabilities are the best users to give you feedback on a thing. A guide is a good thing, and you think you know. I'm taking myself as an example with a physical disability, that if I go to a place where they designed a ramp, for example, and I did it the other day, the ramp was on the side and with the incline, I don't know, 60 degrees, I'm over exaggerating, but no one in a wheelchair will ever get up that. But they've met the requirements. So feedback from people who needs to use the site and have the ability, the disabilities or impairment, will really give you the feedback that you need. And you don't always have access to them, Steve, but it's a really good idea to get that real user feedback before you just design.
And it's not something that I was thinking, I think a lot of people might maybe just do it the first time they deploy a website and then almost forget about it. It should be something that's regularly tested, right? It's not something that's a once-off and then you forget about it and you hope it doesn't or it doesn't regress with time, right? So it's like you say, it's a mindset and it should be regularly checked.
Yeah, I'd add it to your regression like anything else. Is if I've made a UI change to the website, I'm going to regression test it to make sure that I haven't broken some of the previous accessibility provisions I've made. A common one for that would be like if you're using keyboards to navigate the website and you've moved the object orientation around and you've added a new feature, and now the screen reader is kind of doing this down the screen instead of going line by line by line. So for someone trying to use a screen reader, it makes it very difficult. It doesn't make any sense. Or adding videos to your website and putting them as autoplay straight away. So the first thing the person hears is just a blurb of video audio and they don't understand what's going on. You should never have autoplay video. That's another good example of changes that people often put in. They don't think about the ramifications of that would happen when you do that.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to add to that. I think it's to change the tab order on a website is so easy to do, but you don't necessarily understand the impact that's going to have on a person who needs to actually use that feature. And I'm probably putting a target on my back here with developers, but it feels like it's easy to miss that, to actually consider the tab order, especially when you're adding new elements, etc. And that's why it's so important to do ongoing accessibility testing, because you could have tested that tab order 2 months ago. It was all working fine, but since then there's been 6 more releases or 8 more releases, and somewhere there something has gone wrong. So it's almost like if you don't do it on a regular basis, it's almost like creating technical debt as you're going along, and you're getting less and less and less accessible. So it's really important for companies where it's important for them to be very accessible to actually incorporate it as part of their testing and their SDLC.
And that, Leon, is something that we said earlier. There's a heavy manual component to it in terms of manual testing, but that specifically on the tabbing is something definitely that can be automated. So I think we need to think about which components sort of lean towards automation, which ones are manual, because there are opportunities for automation in this space.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, and I think someone alluded to it, so I'll just reiterate. We often think about our customers and our customer base, etc., but your employees are your customers as well to some degree. So if you have internal systems, it's almost as important to do accessibility testing on those systems to make sure that someone mentioned forgetting my glasses, or maybe my mouse stopped working and there's no other mouse in the company, or whatever that situation is. It's equally important. But I'm also being pragmatic here. I know companies aren't necessarily going to invest in getting their internal systems accessible, but I think if it's just at the forefront of people's minds when they do testing and they have some time, and maybe if there's internal development on systems, it's very important to consider as well. Okay, perfect. Thank you, gents. Very, very enlightening, very interesting. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, when we I just want to mention, if you do have anything interesting you want us to discuss, I know I ask every week, but no one has given us any topics yet. So I'm still hoping that at some point someone will actually chip in to say, we really want you to talk about this. So if there's anything that you want us to discuss or anything you think might be interesting to hear about, please let us know. But thank you very much. And until next time, we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.